Oh, it looks right. Yep, here we go. All right, now give me just 2 seconds to share this where it needs to be shared. Share, okay. Just verify I shared it there.
Yeah, it's there because it just came up.
All right. All right. We should be live everywhere. Yeah. We are good to go. We'll begin tonight with our next little part. You remember last week we got through about halfway through, toward the end of Genesis 49. We are studying about the book of Genesis. We are nearing the end of that book. If I could tell you that I was short-winded, I'd tell you we'd be finishing the book tonight. But y'all know me that's nothing I can promise. So we're going to see just how far we get. If we don't finish it tonight, we will finish it next weekend or next Wednesday night. But anyway, so here we begin. We begin back in verse 22. Remember we talked about 10 of the sons of Jacob and talking about his blessing upon them. This is Genesis 49. This is Jacob calling his sons in. And as he has called his sons in, he begins to bless each one of them as his last statements on earth. And so he's blessed them all and given them some prophetic ideas as well as what they're going through at their current moment. So here he talks about Joseph. And Joseph, he says these words: Joseph is a fruitful bough by spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers barely attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By God, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessing of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who is set apart from his brothers. So here you see Joseph is getting what we receive to be the longest blessing in the book of or in the chapter of Genesis 49. And this makes sense because, again, this is his favorite son. Joseph's blessing is longer, but the second longest blessing compared to this is Judah. They are the two prominent tribes we see throughout the rest of the Bible, of Joseph's tribe of Ephraim being that particular one. And so he begins by blessing Joseph as being a fruitful bough. The idea here of a fruitful bough is a son of a fruitful, or a son of fruitfulness, excuse me. That idea of he's blessed upon blessing because of being fruitful. And so he says that he's going to be a fruitful bough. And again, this is part of this blessing of Jacob. Echoes the blessing of God, that seed promise that God has given Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. The idea that they would be a prosperous nation, a great nation, a nation that God would bless, a nation that God would look after. And so he says here, Joseph is that fruitful bough. And then not just a fruitful bough, but a fruitful bough by spring. And this is the idea that it's a bough, a fruitful tree that's going to produce no matter what the weather, no matter how severe, how dangerous, how whatever it may be, is going to be a fruitful bearing tree because it's right by spring. And this is very similar to what the psalmist will talk about in Psalm 1, speaking up about the man who looks to God and follows God's wisdom as being a tree by the water. And so this is the image of Joseph, that he is this fruitful tree that bears fruit upon fruit, and not only fruit upon fruit, but his branches, literally his daughters run over the wall. And the idea is that his daughters, his branches, they spread out even further than where he was before, and they continue to spread. And so this picture of Joseph as being this beautiful, bountiful tree. And then we get to verse 23 and 24 to where part of this is made about Joseph and his past. Notice he says the archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Some will say that some have said that this may be a reference to some of Ephraim's battles, but none of Ephraim's battles seem to be to meet with something like this. And he also speaks about this in the past tense. And so what I think this is that when it says they bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him, this is speaking not of Joseph's future, but of Joseph's past. That this is speaking of how the brothers have attacked Joseph, how they shot at him, how they harassed him, and how eventually they sold him into slavery. And yet in verse 24, we see that yet his bow remained unmoved. Yet his bow, his fighting stance never changed. Although he could have been one who gave up fighting, who realized just how underwhelming his fight was. He realizes here that, or Jacob here blesses him that he didn't unmove his arm. He didn't move his bow, but instead his arms were made agile. The idea is that his arms were able to fight and stand off the bitter attack. And then we see the last part of this is that notice that last phrase, his arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. His hands were made mighty, or his arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one. And that mighty one, as you see is capitalized here, is one of the names of God, of El Shaddai. The idea that God Almighty is there. And this is the God Almighty of Jacob. And so he says that God was with him. And then not only was God there, notice the next part, he describes what God has done for him in that God is the shepherd. Notice from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. The idea that God was not just the God that was with Joseph in the fight and protecting him, the mighty one, but God was there to guide Joseph. And that's going to be sort of the interesting idea of what Joseph's going to say in the next chapter about to his brothers, is that God was with him. God was that shepherd for him. And not only the shepherd, but God was the stone. God was the fortress. God was the rock that would be unmoved. And so here we see this idea of what Jacob's blessing of Joseph, but yet this is a blessing of Joseph, yet it has these connotations about God. And then he goes from there to verse 25, by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and the womb. Again, he says, by God, you'll get this help. By God, you'll receive these blessings. And again, he gets the blessing of Abraham. And Abraham is told to be a blessing, that he would be a blessing to all the people. Joseph has said the very same thing, that God will use Joseph to bless people. And really, when we look at the story of Genesis, especially these last few chapters, we see the truth of that, how Joseph has not just been a blessing to some people, but he's been a blessing to not just his family, but to the entire world at that time, their entire region. And so he says this all comes from God, the God that's looking after him, the God that is protecting him and blessing him. And so this God will bless him with blessings from heaven above, the deep, and also the breast and womb. The idea that he'll be fruitful again. Remember in verse 23 that he would be that fruitful bough, that fruitful tree that will be planted by the water. And then you notice again, the blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents. And so what Jacob does here is recognize that he's been blessed greater than his parents. And some have said this may be a reference to children. Because if you look at the previous recipients of this promise, you look at Abraham, his promise of seed, he was promised he'd become a mighty nation, but yet he had one son. Then you look at his son, Isaac. He was promised again, he'd become a great nation, but yet his great nation had two sons, Esau and Jacob. But then we get to Jacob, the same one given that blessing that he would become a great nation. He has 12 sons. And here we see by the time Jacob is a few years have passed with his sons, and Jacob moves to Egypt. Remember when we looked at that number of 17 years before this point, there were 70 people in Jacob's tribe and Jacob's people to grow. He's growing substantially according to this promise. And so Jacob basically gives Joseph the blessings of his parents, the blessing of his father. What we see here really, and I probably should have said this earlier, is that Jacob is blessing Joseph with the blessing of the firstborn. That firstborn blessing that's twofold. He already gave that to him in chapter 48. Here he is expounding upon that. Again, asking the blessing of his father. Tell him he's going to be blessed just as he is. And again, this is the longest blessing, showing his significance. And again, he says that God will bless you to the bounties of the everlasting hills. That God will bless you. That it's not about the desert mountains that had been around, but the mountains that produced and that are always producing. And then he says, may they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who is set apart from his brothers. And again, Jacob designates and recognizes Joseph as being not just his favorite son, but also the son that would receive this blessing of the firstborn, the blessing of God. And then from there, we go to the last son, the youngest son, the son of Benjamin. As always see here, Benjamin is described as a ravenous wolf. In the morning, devouring the prey, and at evening, dividing the spoil. Now, this is sort of an interesting idea, an interesting concept about Benjamin, because when we look at Benjamin and every other encounter here, what we see through all the other passages up till this point is we see Benjamin as being almost the weakling, almost the weakest member. Because when Jacob sends his sons, he sends them all but Benjamin. He protects Benjamin. Jacob goes to great lengths to protect Benjamin. Then when they send him, even Judah goes to great lengths to let them take Benjamin by offering himself in Benjamin's place. And even when they go to Joseph, they beg Joseph, not before they know it's Joseph, they beg Joseph to let Benjamin go. Let Benjamin return home to his father. Don't take him. Take me, and Judah, please take me in his place. Let me fulfill this spot that you're condemning him to. Let me have this position. And so what we typically see in the Genesis story is that Benjamin is pictured as being a weaker, again, the younger son, that's not as, maybe not as proficient as the other brothers. And again, that may not be the full picture of Benjamin, but that's sort of the one we get from Scripture. But here Jacob says Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. Now, what's interesting about this is a prophecy, I believe a prophecy about how Benjamin may have been at this time, but eventually how Benjamin's going to get. Because when we look at the children of Israel, when they get into the promised land, and we look at Judges, and we look at 1st, 2nd Samuel, some of the most fierce warriors that the Israelite nation has are the Benjamites. The Benjamites were very skilled men. They were very fierce warriors. Saul, the first king of Israel, comes from the Benjamites. And he was known for him and his family as being a strong and courageous man and other courageous men. So the Benjamites would later live up to this prophecy that they would be a ravenous wolf. And again, the idea is that in the morning, they're devouring the prey. In the morning, they attack and they destroy those who stand in their way. And then in the evening, they divide the spoil. It's sort of the idea that they are so ravenous that they just attack all the day long, and then when the day's over, they go back and they figure out their shares. That they're more worried about or more concerned about the fight and winning the fight than they are about the spoils that may be associated with it. And so they're described as this wolf that enjoys their spoil and enjoys the fight. And that's sort of the way the Benjamites are later presented to be. And so this is Jacob's blessing. This is how Jacob has blessed his 12 sons. And again, he's blessed these 12 sons plus the 2 adopted sons. So technically in 48 and 49, he blesses 14 people. But then verse 28, these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with a blessing suitable to him. Then he commanded and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. Now, before we go on and finish this statement of Jacob, I want to go back and look at what he says here. Now, you notice verse 28, he blesses these 12 men, these 12 sons, and again, they're called 12 tribes. This is a history of Israel, and this is preparing us for the book of Genesis. Our Exodus is preparing us for the story of Israel. And so he blessed them. And you notice that he blessed them with a blessing suitable to him. Each one has their unique blessing, their blessing that speaks of their situation and also their future situation. And then again, we get in verse 29 and 30, we see his again swearing, making his sons. He knows verse 29, he commanded them. He again told them, I want to be buried with my fathers. And you notice he says, I'm to be gathered to my people. Again, this is very plainly, very clearly way of seeing that he says, I'm about to die. My end is here. I am about to be gathered to my people. My life's about over. That this is what I want you to do. And notice he says, bury me with my fathers. Bury me in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. And he begins to describe where that cave is. And he tells them the history of that this is the history of the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought as a place to possess for a burying place. And again, we talk about this, that Abraham was promised the land of Canaan, but yet in his lifetime, the only land he got was this cave, was the field in this cave where he would bury him, where he'd bury his wife Sarah, and where he himself would later be buried. And so this is, again, the idea that he wants to have, or he has the faith, the assurance that God is going to provide for him, that God is going to fulfill his promise. And his promise is not to be in Egypt, not to be buried in Egypt, but to be buried with his fathers. And then he goes on from there in verse 31. He says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. Now, notice the last words recorded by Jacob is he's telling the history of his family. He says, I want to be buried in the cave. Now, this list of people that's in the cave is interesting to me because notice he says, there they buried Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. He says this is a family tomb. And the interesting thing about all this is that last part, the last person mentioned there, where he says, this is where I buried Leah. This is where Jacob says he wants to be buried with Leah. Now, what's interesting about this is that Jacob would have still known where Rachel was buried. Remember, Rachel is that favored wife. Rachel is the wife that he worked so hard for, the wife that's typically called his favorite wife, but yet in death, he wants to be with his fathers and he wants to be in that family tomb and he wants to be buried with Leah. Now, some have suggested that maybe through the years after Rachel passed, that maybe Jacob found a place in his heart for Leah, a greater place in his heart for Leah. We really don't know, but it is very, very interesting that he is choosing buried with his, again, the less favored wife for the early part of his life, and to be buried with his fathers, then to be buried where Rachel is. But again, I think this may have more to do also with his father and grandfather being buried here. And this is an interesting thing. Now, the way they did burying was a little different than we do. They had these caves that they would bury in. And these caves would typically have a shelf, a flat spot for you to lay a body on. And some caves had different chambers. Some people think that maybe Abraham bought this cave for him and Sarah, and Isaac come in here later and built the chamber for him and Rebekah, and then later Jacob built the chamber for him and Leah. But we don't know. What basically this is they would go into a cave and they would it would have a shelf, basically a flat spot that you would lay the body on. And then depending on who it is, as I said, some families would have different chambers. They dig out another shelf or dig out another area for their loved one, or some would just basically, from what history tells us, if it was a poorer family, they would take the body that's laying there, and they would take the new body and push the older body back. So basically all the remains would get sort of mixed together. But this is how they would bury them. They would all bury them in this one similar cave. And this cave would be a family cave, and they would put usually a rock over, like we see in the story of Jesus, to protect anything from getting out to it. And here Jacob is telling his sons, this is where I want to be buried. And I want to be buried in this specific place. And you notice when Jacob finished this, he finishes his last words. He commands his son these last words. He drew up his feet and breathed his last. And he was finally gathered to his people. What he said was going to happen, that he was going home. He was going to be gathered with his father and his grandfather once again, that he was, the idea, again, a very interesting thing, that gathered to his people seems to imply that he had an understanding of the afterlife. And it's something we sometimes don't think about with the Old Testament. But here we get, that ends chapter 49. Chapter 49 and 50 have a really hard break here because, and I have to say, this is one of the places I don't like the way the Bible, I forgot the guy's name who broke down the chapter verse of the Bible. I don't like the way he broke it here because really from verse 28 following should have been chapter 50 if you're going to break it here. But he chose here, we get to chapter 50 to see what happens next. As soon as Jacob passed, notice, then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many were required for, or how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And that father's not supposed to be there. It's just supposed to be for 70 days. So notice what happens here. This is a very interesting point I had not thought about before. You remember a few chapters ago when God tells Jacob to go to Egypt. Remember, Jacob's getting ready to go and he's not sure. God comes to him and says, I'll be with you. I'll watch over you. I'll protect you. One of the part of that blessing that he gives Jacob is that if you go down to Egypt, then Joseph, your son, will be with you when you die. That Joseph, basically the promise is that Joseph will be the one that closes your eyes. And here we see that very thing happen. And that as soon as Jacob passes, Joseph's the one. Again, all 12 brothers are here, but here we see again this beautiful relationship between a father and son of how it comes to fruition here. That Joseph falls on his father and he weeps on him and kisses him and is overcome with grief. And then in verse 2, Joseph does something that's very unusual in the Israelite culture, not unusual in Egyptians, but very unusual for Israelites. And that is that he said, he commands the servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. And you notice the emphasis here is the physicians. The physicians did this. This is basically the healers. But what's interesting is that this embalming process was a process that the Egyptians typically did. We know the Egyptians, known well for their mummies. This was that process of mummification. And what they would do, from what I've gathered, is the Israelites, or the Egyptians, excuse me, they would make cuts at a person's major organs, and they would remove those organs, and they would place those organs in jars to be contained and buried with the person. And then they would put a type of salt or a chemical on the body, the outward body. They would stuff the inside of the body with spices and aloes, that kind of smelly things that would help preserve the body. And that was the basic idea of this embalming, was that it would preserve the body. And this is an interesting thing because you notice the next verse 3, 40 days it was required to do this, or it took 40 days to do this process. These men and the Egyptians were very skilled in this process to make sure they covered everything that they could to make sure the body was as well preserved as it could. This stands out in the cultural background of that time and that world, even to the time of Christ, in that typically, if you didn't embalm, if you weren't a high official of the Egyptians and have a royal, or either royalty or richness, you were buried within the same day. Most funerals took place, what we consider a funeral, most burials took place within 24 hours. And they did that because they were in a hot, arid part of the world. And as a body dies, that body begins to decay. And so this is what Joseph does. Joseph commands the physicians to begin to work on his father's body, because he realizes that Joseph and his brothers have to take Jacob back to Canaan. And this is going to be a lengthy process. And Joseph knows that if something's not done, then the body's going to decay. And basically, they're not going to be able to fulfill his father's dying wish, his father's dying request. So he begins to embalm him. Now, back up to verse 2. And you notice that I emphasize this repeated part, the physicians. What's interesting about the Egyptians is that the mummification process was very religious. This was typically done by physicians, the healers, and the priests. They would offer the body, they'd offer the organs and the process to a couple of their different gods. And so it's very interesting that Joseph, or the Genesis writer, emphasizes this, the physicians, not the priests who do this. And again, I believe that's to show that although he went through this process, he did not go through the religious side of it. He did not go through the Egyptian belief, the Egyptian following of their gods, and so forth and so on. Now, the next question comes in verse 3, and that is, do these days of mourning overlap? Because you notice verse 3 says 40 days were required for it, 40 days to embalm a body. And that's another interesting thing to see how far we've gotten today. You know, we talk about still today embalming, not exactly the same process they did, far from that process. But our process takes a few hours or a day to do. Their process, it took 40 days to properly embalm the body. And so this is what it took. And so the physicians worked for 40 days. And then you notice the Egyptians wept for him for 70s. And the question I was saying that people have is, do the 40 days of the embalming process include the 70, or the 70 days include the 40, or were these 70 days after the 40 days were over? And some have tried to make some questions about that. We really don't know. Either way, there's no emphasis. The real emphasis here is the 70 days that they wept for Jacob. Why that is significant is because 70 days is the typical length of mourning for the death of a king or of royalty. And what this does is this reveals to us what Joseph has done and what Jacob has done. That apparently in the 17 years in Israel, that Jacob has impressed Pharaoh. Jacob has impressed the higher ups of the Egyptians, that they're treating him just like royalty. Again, whether it's for his son or someone else, we don't know. But this shows us how the Egyptians treated him. And not just this, there are some more points we're going to get to in just a minute if we get there tonight. That's going to give us some more insight into this, into what the Egyptians do. Then you notice verse 4, when the days of weeping for him were past, that is, the 70 days are over, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please let me speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I've hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore, let me go, please go up and bury my father, then I will return. Now, you know, some will take here and say, oh, well, Joseph has lost his favor in the kingdom of Pharaoh because he goes to the household of Pharaoh first. No, there's a real good explanation for this, I think. And that is that Joseph's in mourning. And typically in their world, when you are mourning, you didn't necessarily put on the nicest clothes. You didn't shave. Some would go unbathed, depending on how great the morning was. And what we've seen earlier in the story of Joseph around the beginning of this, remember when Pharaoh has the dream that Joseph is in those clothes of a prisoner? You remember before Pharaoh will see him, he has to be shaven, he has to be clean, he has to be putting new clothes on. So basically, I think what's happening here is that he goes to the household of Pharaoh to let them know his request, although he's not proper himself to go before Pharaoh. And I think this is another way, too, of him asking his household to ask Pharaoh for him. And that's sort of what we see, because we never really hear of Joseph going to Pharaoh at this time, but him speaking to the family. Now, what's interesting about this is that Joseph repeats what his father told him for the most part. In that he repeats that he's supposed to go to Canaan. He wants to be buried in the family tomb. Bury me there. Now, what he doesn't tell them is the time that Joseph, and we saw this earlier, Jacob basically tells Joseph and the brothers, do not bury me in Egypt. I do not want to be buried in Egypt. And some writers think that Joseph probably leaves that part out for the sake of maybe upsetting Pharaoh or making Pharaoh not be happy with the request. And then he basically asked Pharaoh for time off to go bury his father. And he knows, he says, now therefore, let me please go up. Let me please go up and bury my father. Then he says, then I'll return. And here's the other thing about this, is that Joseph is still valuable in the kingdom. Because just like Nehemiah, we're going to see later, when he begs to go back to Jerusalem to build the city wall, he'll have to tell the king, if you'll let me go, I will come back. I will come back and do this job. And here Joseph is telling the Pharaoh, I don't want to leave the kingdom. I just want to go and bury my father. If you'll let me go bury my father, let me go to Canaan, go to the cave where he died, or where his family is buried. Let me bury him there. Then I will return and I will work with you once again. And then you notice that Joseph, the Pharaoh comes back. He answers him, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. So basically what we see here is Pharaoh says, go bury your father. He made you swear to this, go bury him. I give you permission to go. And so Joseph goes up, and then you notice that with him goes the servants of Pharaoh. And another way of translating this, servants of Pharaoh, could be part of Pharaoh's army, or it's going to be implied too from what we're going to see in a minute. But these are the household of Pharaoh goes up. The elders of Pharaoh's household, the elders of the land of Egypt. These are the who's who of Egyptian royalty go with Joseph and his family. And again, this gives us, I believe, some insight into the effect and into the influence that Jacob has had on the Egyptians. And he knows, verse 8, that Joseph goes up and his brothers go up and his father's household. The only ones they leave behind are the children. And again, this is probably the younger children who are not able to make this trip on their own. We're not able to make this treacherous journey. It's not an easy journey. Remember when they came to Egypt in the first place, Joseph has to send the wagons to go and bring the children and the mothers and the elderly back. And so this is basically what they're doing, is they're letting the weaker, the younger and older stay behind. And not just that, they leave their flocks and their herds. They leave their shepherds behind to watch over these flocks and herds. And again, this is very important, because this is another sign to Pharaoh that, hey, they're coming back. If they leave their herds, they leave their children, then this is a sign that they're going to come back. They're not leaving. They're not abandoning you, going to get another army. And again, where it's key is that sometimes this would happen, and they would go and create an army in another place and get ready to attack, because they knew the inner workings of this. And this may have been what Pharaoh may have been, or some of his officials may have been worried about. But with everything they do, they know that Joseph and his family are up and up. They know that they are doing what they need to do, how they need to do it, and what needs to be done. So this is what we see here. I think for tonight, I'm trying to think of a good place to stop. I really don't know if we've got a better place to stop than right here. It is 7:35. I don't want to, I can keep talking all night about this story and finish this, but I don't want to. I told you earlier, we may not get through this chapter. We're going to stop here at verse 9 for tonight. We'll pick back up here next week. We'll talk about verse 9 and see the rest of Jacob's funeral procession. And then we'll see what the brothers do with Joseph, what their reaction is to him. Again, I appreciate everyone being with us tonight. I appreciate you joining us. Anybody have any questions that are on our Zoom class? All right. If not, we look forward to hopefully seeing you all Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'll have our live stream on YouTube and Facebook there as well. We'll also have our live stream of FBI next Tuesday night and also our Wednesday night Bible class next Wednesday night. Appreciate all those who have joined us. Appreciate y'all being here. We hope you all have a good week, and we will see you next time.